Opening the center immediately creates dynamic possibilities and invites early confrontation. Instantly, black challenges white's central foothold, aiming to deny easy pawn occupation and steer the game towards dynamic imbalances. Developing the knight here prepares for a central pawn push and solidifies the e4 pawn, aiming for rapid piece activity and a spatial advantage. Developing knights towards the center creates immediate central tension and prepares for pawn breaks. Developing the knight and preparing to strike at the center sets a classic English opening trap for an unprepared Sicilian defender. Embracing the dragon's wing, black prepares to fianchetto, aiming for long-range pressure on the queenside diagonal and a resilient pawn structure. Opening the center immediately, this aggressively challenges black's setup and creates dynamic possibilities. Opening the center with this capture immediately creates dynamic lines and forces white to consider immediate central pawn advances. Recapturing the pawn consolidates the center, but opens up diagonal lines for black's pieces. Developing the bishop to the long diagonal immediately targets white's center and prepares for kingside castling. Shifting the knight to b3 cleverly sidesteps the impending pawn push on c5, simultaneously preparing to redeploy it to a more active square, perhaps c5 or even a4, to exert influence over the queenside and support potential pawn advances like b4. This maneuver avoids immediate confrontation while subtly building a flexible structure for the middle game. Developing this knight to f6 solidifies black's central pawn structure and prepares for castling, while simultaneously eyeing white's d4 pawn and creating potential tactical shots if white isn't careful. Securing the central pawns and preparing for castling, white aims to solidify their structure while keeping options open. This steady development prioritizes piece coordination, hinting at a strategic buildup rather than immediate aggression. Securing the king behind a shield of pawns is a prudent step, standard in this Sicilian-Dragon setup, preparing for the inevitable pawn storming and piece exchanges that lie ahead. Securing the king in the castle completes development, a sensible priority after challenging the center. Now white prepares to mobilize pieces and exert pressure, potentially on the queen side or through central pawn thrusts depending on black's response. Reinforcing the pawn chain and preparing for potential central pawn thrusts, d6 offers a solid foundation while simultaneously opening a diagonal for the dark-squared bishop, suggesting a deliberate, patient buildup rather than an immediate confrontation. Preparing to seize the open d-file with the rook, this move also subtly prepares for a potential kingside advance, subtly influencing the pawn structure and hinting at future central control. Embracing the flank, black initiates a queenside expansion, aiming to counter white's central occupation and prepare for potential pawn advances or piece maneuvers on that wing, while keeping options open for e5. Opening up the diagonal for the queen is the primary objective, aiming to facilitate active piece play and potentially exploit weaknesses on the queen side where black's pawn structure is less consolidated. This repositioning also prepares for a potential kingside pawn storm or a central breakthrough. Opening lines for the queen's bishop, aiming to pressure white's central pawns and prepare for potential pawn breaks on the queen side, while simultaneously solidifying the dark square complex. Pinning that knight against the king instantly raises the stakes on the king side, creating a subtle yet persistent pressure point that black must address carefully. Bringing the rook to the c-file establishes immediate tension along an open line, potentially setting the stage for future breakthroughs or reinforcing pressure against white's queenside structure. A sharp thrust into the opponent's territory, aiming to exploit the now vacant d5 square and potentially disrupt black's harmonious development, this knight aggressively challenges the central tension. Suddenly, the queenside pawn structure faces pressure as the e6 square, previously a defensive bastion, now invites tactical skirmishes and opens avenues for the opponent's bishop on f1. Returning the knight to its starting square appears to be a subtle repositioning, aiming to free up the d-file for potential central pressure or to prepare for a future maneuver, perhaps a knight sortie to a more active diagonal. This reassures the king's safety for now and allows the pawn structure to remain solid, avoiding immediate tactical complications. It's a move that prioritizes flexibility and the long-term development of pieces, suggesting white is less concerned with immediate pawn captures and more interested in building a harmonious setup before committing to an aggressive plan. The piece is now less exposed and ready to support a central pawn push or to defend squares if needed. Solidifying the queenside structure and preparing for potential pawn breaks in the center are the primary aims here, preventing white's knight from further incursions and creating a more resilient pawn chain. A bold redeployment of the queen, aiming to bolster the kingside and potentially support a later f4 push, while simultaneously avoiding any immediate tactical complications on the queenside where black's pieces are becoming quite active. Black seizes the opportunity to expand on the queenside, aiming to destabilize white's central pawn structure and create potential play on that flank. This aggressive pawn push injects dynamism into the position, forcing white to reconsider their own plans and potentially shift focus away from their kingside ambitions. It's a bold statement, challenging white to prove the soundness of their central control and whether they can withstand the encroaching queenside pressure. This initiative solidifies white's central pawn presence, aiming to exert pressure along the d-file and prepare for potential pawn breakthroughs. Emerging from the shadows of the queenside, the knight on e5 casts an imposing gaze towards white's kingside, probing for weaknesses and preparing to disrupt the established pawn structure. Solidifying the central pawn structure, this maneuver aims to prevent black's intended knight or bishop sorties towards the king's defenses, and subtly restricts the scope of the dark-squared bishop. The knight embarks on an ambitious patrol, eyeing the weakened d2 square and potentially disrupting white's central control, though it ventures into territory that could become a tactical crossroads given the existing piece formations. Initiating a capture sequence, white exchanges a bishop for a knight, aiming to simplify the position and potentially open lines for their rooks. This exchange, however, also relinquishes white's influence over the important dark squares surrounding their king, a factor that could become critical later. It addresses black's pawn structure's potential for advanced play on the queenside, but at the cost of a well-placed attacker. The resulting pawn structure will present new opportunities and challenges for both players to navigate. Opening up the b-file with the capture fundamentally alters the pawn structure, creating isolated queenside pawns for black and a potentially powerful passed pawn on c4 for white, while simultaneously freeing the rook on c8. The knight's awkward retreat to c1 abandons the central pressure it was building, creating a passive outpost and signaling a defensive posture rather than an offensive initiative. Opening the queen to the queenside injects immediate dynamism, forcing white's king to consider a new diagonal and potentially creating tactical opportunities around the d1h5 axis if the opponent isn't careful. Challenging black's initiative, white reroutes the bishop to square e3, aiming to bolster the queenside defense and prepare for potential counterplay along the now open c-file. Seizing the initiative, black snatches the pawn, creating immediate complications and forcing white to defend a vulnerable queen, potentially disrupting white's carefully constructed kingside defense and opening up new avenues for counterplay along the queenside files if white misfires. Seeking to untangle the knight's awkward position, white bravely redeploys its steed to a more central square, aiming to activate it in the ongoing maneuvering battle and perhaps target the now exposed black queen. Black's queen is now dangerously exposed, a tempting target on a3. White has a clear plan: consolidate the rook on the d-file and exploit the queen's misplaced position. The immediate threat isn't capture, but rather forcing the queen into a passive retreat, surrendering valuable tempo. White's pieces are subtly coordinating, aiming to build pressure on the queenside while keeping the king safe. This isn't about immediate fireworks, but about building a superior positional advantage through precise maneuvering. Sacrificing the queen offers black a significant material advantage, a bold, albeit potentially reckless, attempt to recover some positional initiative after a series of passive moves. With the queen exchange, black aims to simplify the position and reduce white's attacking potential, hoping to transition into a more manageable middle game where the pawn structure on the queen side might offer some counterplay. The rook sweep to the 6th rank immediately establishes dominance over the d-file, creating a powerful battery with the queen and threatening to penetrate black's queenside defenses. This maneuver significantly restricts black's maneuvering space and forces them to constantly be on guard against further incursions. The rook now joins the defensive skirmish on the c-file, aiming to provide support for the potentially exposed pawns and re-establish some equilibrium on this contested open file. The immediate recapture of the rook, tidying up the pawn structure, simplifies the position into a somewhat unusual endgame where white has regained material equality, but black's queenside pawns remain fractured, creating potential targets as the game progresses. Recapturing the bishop solidifies black's central pawn majority, aiming to leverage its potential for future pawn breaks and restrict white's minor pieces. A bold assertion of control over the queenside rook file emerges, forcing black to address the imminent pressure along the newly opened lane. The knight finds a new outpost on d7, reinforcing the pawn chain and preparing to support the rook's advance or potentially hop to a more active square like c5 to harass white's queenside. Repositioning the rook to the 4th rank aims to exert pressure along that open file, potentially threatening black's central pawn structure and offering a new line of attack should the opponent misplace their pieces. Instead of accepting the pawn sacrifice, black's decision to reinforce the c6 square with the rook now aims to activate this piece for potential counterplay along the central files, leveraging the recent exchange of queens to potentially equalize the position. Reclaiming the central pawn stabilizes white's structure, aiming to leverage the open c-file for future pressure, and initiating a simplified endgame where piece activity and pawn majority will become crucial considerations. The knight's audacious leap to e5 immediately challenges white's central pawn majority and eyes the weakened light squares on the kingside, aiming to disrupt white's carefully constructed pawn chain and open avenues for counterplay. Reclaiming the central file provides a crucial outlet for the rook, preparing to contest the open position and potentially targeting the enemy's compromised pawn structure, forcing a strategic decision about piece redeployment. The knight retreats to a more central square, eyeing the d6 pawn and preparing to contest the open c-file, a subtle shift from its previous passive deployment. Gaining a crucial tempo by forcing the knight back, white aims to exploit the unprotected pawn on c4 and prepare for a potential kingside advance, aiming to secure more central space and limit black's activity. The bishop's retreat to b7 aims to re-establish a defensive outpost for the piece, eyeing the now exposed queenside pawns and creating potential counterplay along the b-file should it ever open. Opening the floodgates for the rook on the file, this maneuver seeks to exploit the potential weaknesses created by black's advanced pawn structure, aiming to force concessions or initiate a decisive exchange in the coming turns. Pushing the rook to the 4th rank immediately contests the open file, aiming to exchange black's most active piece and simplify the position, potentially leading to an endgame where the slightly more centralized knight might gain a foothold. The king embarks on an adventurous journey, seeking to activate itself from its precarious initial shelter and join the fray. Unleashing the pawn storm begins, a bold attempt to seize initiative by disrupting white's centralized pieces and creating immediate attacking potential on the kingside, aiming to exploit any lingering weaknesses around the white monarch. The pawn advance finally cracks open the isolated c-file, injecting immediate dynamism into a previously static position and creating new avenues for the rooks to exploit. Opening up the king's pawn structure signals a bold attempt to reignite attacking chances, transforming the board into a dynamic battlefield where both monarchs are suddenly more exposed. The monarch emerges from its protective castling shell, seeking a more active role on the kingside, a daring maneuver that could either solidify white's emerging pawn structure or leave it exposed to black's advancing pieces. The black monarch ventures forward, seeking a more active role and potentially an escape from the looming rook activity on the d-file, while simultaneously eyeing the possibility of supporting pawn advances. Shifting the monarch towards the kingside, 33. KD2 aims to consolidate the king's position away from the central files and prepares for potential pawn pushes or piece maneuvering that might arise in the coming stages of the game. The knight's foray to e5 injects dynamism into the center, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and potentially initiate pawn breaks or central exchanges that could simplify the position to black's advantage. Initiating a flanking maneuver, the rook on b3 seeks to outflank black's somewhat passive knight and potentially infiltrate the queenside, aiming to disrupt black's defensive structure. A strategic regrouping is initiated as black's knight aims to find a more active post, potentially supporting advances or defending vulnerable pawns. The monarch retreats, a pragmatic sidestep to avoid the looming central action and consolidate a more secure position away from the open files. That knight venturing back to the c4 square seems eager to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially threaten the c3 pawn should it advance. It's a flexible piece, offering support to the queenside and eyeing the d2 square, creating a slight headache for the white king's comfortable central placement. Pondering the board, the bishop retreats, its offensive spear point blunted, now seeking a less exposed perch to support the advancing kingside pawn structure and prepare for potential queen activity should the opponent commit their knight further. Unleashing the e-pawn aims to break the central deadlock and open lines for active piece play, potentially creating mating threats against white's somewhat exposed monarch. Sensing an opportunity to exploit the now exposed king, white aims to create a powerful outpost for the knight on the queenside, aiming to disrupt black's potential pawn pushes and restrict its mobility. Recognizing the looming threat of the knight's shuttle and aiming to consolidate its presence, the bishop retreats to a more defensible square. Reclaiming the outpost on c5 grants the knight a commanding central presence, eyeing weaknesses and potentially pinning down black's pieces, while simultaneously preparing for a pawn advance that could liberate white's kingside. A bold attempt to activate the bishop, though its journey to c8 appears rather indirect, potentially allowing white to consolidate gains on the kingside and restrict further counterplay. Seeking to finally consolidate pieces and perhaps prepare a kingside advance, the knight repositions. Deploying the bishop to d6 aims to centralize this piece, potentially eyeing the king's flank or supporting advances on the kingside. Repositioning the bishop to g3 aims to prepare an eventual pawn advance on the kingside, specifically pushing the f-pawn to f4, which could create a strong central presence and potentially open lines against black's somewhat cramped king. It's a subtle attempt to build attacking potential rather than making an immediate concession or tactical threat. The bishop finally finds its place on e6, aiming to bolster the central pawn structure and potentially prepare a pawn push on the kingside, while also eyeing the b3 pawn, which is currently undefended. Unleashing the pawn is a bold attempt to disrupt black's finely tuned pawn structure, aiming to create weaknesses and perhaps open a path for the rooks, but it also significantly weakens white's own king. Embracing the pawn push forward creates immediate pawn chain tension, forcing white to commit to either defending the c3 square or allowing further penetration. Stealing the initiative through a forced king repositioning, this move ignites a tactical fireworks display by creating an unavoidable fork on the enemy monarch, ultimately aiming to dismantle black's defensive structure and exploit the exposed king. A decisive attempt to simplify and consolidate gains, this knight exchange, while seemingly logical, relinquishes a crucial defensive piece that was effectively harassing white's king. Black sacrifices valuable time and central control for a slightly cleaner board, but the weakened king position will likely become a significant liability as the game progresses towards an endgame. Reclaiming the center with the pawn opens lines for your rooks and aims to exploit the slight awkwardness of black's knight. Reclaiming the bishop from its somewhat passive post on e7 allows black to contemplate more active piece play, aiming to challenge white's centralized knight and potentially exploit the semi-open f-file for future counterplay. Securing the rook's path to the third rank, this repositioning prepares to contest the crucial d-file and potentially launch a kingside assault, aiming to exploit black's somewhat passive development. The bishop's repositioning to a3 aims to activate this piece and potentially disrupt white's control of the d-file, while also offering a subtle hint towards future pawn advancements on the king side. Opening the b-file gives your rook a clear pathway to attack the weak pawns and potentially penetrate black's position. Unleashing the bishop to its active diagonal, the piece aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially threaten the king's safety, looking to exploit the open c-file. Seizing the open file, the rook now lurks on the 6th rank, a constant menace to black's decentralized pieces and offering a potential escape square for the white king should it be needed. The bishop, after a long journey, now aims to disrupt the rook's comfortable position and potentially liberate the knight on d7, solidifying the pawn chain to create a more robust defensive structure, while simultaneously preparing to bring the king into a more active central role. Sacrificing the bishop for the king's pursuit opens a wild endgame, aiming to use the passed pawns and the unleashed rook to overwhelm white's slightly exposed monarch. The white knight repositions, aiming to solidify control of the central squares and potentially exploit weaknesses in black's pawn structure after the recent exchanges, while seeking to avoid any immediate tactical threats. The black rook now finds itself on a critical square, aiming to dismantle white's remaining pawn structure after a series of exchanges, though its placement might offer some counterplay for the knight. King hunt initiated as the rook slides to the 7th rank, directly threatening the black king and forcing it into the open. The king, now exposed by the prior pawn advances, attempts to find a safer haven behind the remaining pawns, a desperate bid for sanctuary as white's rook presses aggressively on the open file. Securing the rook on a more active diagonal drastically improves its attacking potential against black's exposed king. Relocating the king to the queen side offers a safer haven, shielding it from the rook's active presence and preparing for potential pawn advances to support the remaining pieces. Activating the rook to support the pawn's advance creates immediate dynamic possibilities on the queen side. Embracing a sudden tactical burst, black sacrifices a pawn on the e-file to finally activate the dormant king and inject a dynamic element into what had become a rather passive position. Retreating the rook to the d-file aims to consolidate white's position after the pawn exchange, seeking to activate the piece and potentially pressure black's king or central pawns, though the immediate impact feels passive. The rook's repositioning to c4 aims to activate the piece, seeking active opposition against white's recently advanced king and potentially supporting a breakthrough pawn push later. Prioritizing king safety, the monarch shuffles backward to a more protected square. Unleashing the pawn storm, black gambles on creating chaos in the center, hoping to dislodge white's entrenched king and expose weaknesses before a full pawn chain can solidify. The bishop now retreats, seeking a safer haven after its previous foray, aiming to bolster the pawn chain and prepare for a potential counterthrust. A bold foray into enemy territory, seeking to disrupt white's consolidating rook and create counterplay with the passed pawn, though it might leave the king a tad exposed. A determined push to activate the rook and challenge black's newly mobile king. The king's perilous journey across the battlefield culminates in a desperate check, aiming to disrupt white's newfound material advantage and create complications in the rook and pawn endgame. The white king ventures out, but the unleashed pawns storm on the king side, coupled with the exposed black monarch, creates a volatile tactical scenario where both players must be acutely aware of potential discovered attacks and mating threats. The king suddenly finds itself exposed, a magnet for attack across the open board. Unleashing the bishop from its passive position opens up a diagonal and hints at a desire to coordinate with the rook for a potential endgame advantage. That unexpected sacrifice aims to disrupt white's king's safety by forcing its way into enemy territory, creating immediate tactical complications. The king scurries towards the action, aiming to support the rook's advances and potentially create mating threats or secure a safe haven. The pawn's final advance to e2 is a desperate attempt to create a passed pawn, aiming to distract the white king and potentially force a draw by promotion, though it seems unlikely to succeed given the limited support. Initiating a forceful king hunt, The rook's timely sortie to the 7th rank threatens immediate checkmate or significant material gain, forcing black's king into a precarious position. Securing the king against potential checks and establishing a more robust defensive posture is paramount now. The king's perilous journey across the board now seems inevitable, with the rooks poised to exploit the open diagonals and the central pawn structure. The king's pilgrimage across the board, seeking refuge, now encounters potential danger as it edges closer to the enemy flank, a risky maneuver that could backfire if the opponent orchestrates a swift attack. The rook aggressively invades, aiming to exploit the weakened diagonal created by black's pawn push, potentially isolating the king or forcing further concessions. The king's bold excursion, now exposed on the light squares, desperately seeks a sanctuary amidst the looming threat of white's reinforced pieces and open diagonals. The king boldly ventures into enemy territory, a daring foray to escape the perpetual stalemate and potentially disrupt black's rook activity. The pawn's advance now seeks to create a critical weakness on the king side, aiming to liberate the rook and potentially open lines for a desperate counterattack. A bold gamble in this endgame where material is balanced but activity is paramount.